Since I've worked from home for nearly a year now, I thought it was about time to invest in my home office, which is a bedroom that my wife and I have converted into a working space. I work my full time job in there, and I spend a good bit of time in the evenings editing video and planning my projects in that same space. To get more organized, I wanted to create two 6 foot tall cabinets with plenty of space for my computer gear and office supplies, as well as space for books, pictures, and whatever else I find that needs a place to live. So for this project, I went with walnut veneered plywood. I wanted the cabinets to match the solid walnut desktop that I'm planning to build, but using plywood for the cabinets would end up being much cheaper and take less time to build, which are both pluses in my book. I started by breaking down the plywood into manageable chunks using my track saw and centipede work holder. This is how I begin every project that uses sheet goods. The 1/4 inch plywood is easy enough to handle at the table saw, and I only need to cut 2 strips, which will become the back panels for each cabinet. Once I cut the sheet in half, I then cut each half slightly larger than what I'll end up needing in the end. I won't cut them to final width and length until later when I have the cabinets built. And wouldn't you know it, I turned my back on them for 1 second. Now for the rest of the parts, my goal here is to cut everything to final dimensions. I start with the side panels, and they'll need the rough factory edges ripped off. By the way, I am using an 80-tooth saw blade here on the table saw to cut these veneered panels. To trim the ends of the side panels, I gang the two sides together, and I'm going to cut them at once with my track saw. This is going to guarantee that I get the exact same length for both sides. Now early on, I set aside some nice straight grain panels to make the doors and drawer fronts from, and I'm using frog tape here to make sure that the edges were cut as cleanly as possible since these are the show faces. Now once I get the sides cut, I move on to cutting the dividers and the shelves for each cabinet. I went ahead and I masked off the shelves too since I already had the tape out. The primary joinery on these cabinets are going to be dados in the sides. I'll use pocket holes for the back stretchers, but everything else needs to be glued, so dados it is. I laid out the two sides together so I can mark out the joinery in each at the same time. This is going to help me make sure that I cut the dados in the right spot and that they all match up when it comes time for assembly. I also like doing it this way because it helps me visualize what the two sides are going to look like when they come together, because this joinery needs to be cut in mirror to one another, and this is going to help me avoid cutting the exact same joinery in both sides and ending up with two side panels that don't match. Now one tip that I have for you here is that I'm going to use a long offcut of the same material plywood to help lay things out, and that's going to make sure that my dados are laid out to the exact width they need to be, so I can kind of visualize how that looks also. Now, before I make those cuts in the sides, I'm going to go ahead and add the edge banding. Doing the edge banding now is going to make sure that when I cut the dados, they go through the finished edge, and I don't have to go back and try to figure out how to get edge banding around an already cut notch. Now I'm using iron-on banding, which is super easy to apply, but it is a little squirrely to keep straight over a 6-foot edge. I just worked it in sections as best I could, and I think it turned out good. Once I clipped the edges and trimmed the sides with this sweet edge trimmer, I gave it all a light sanding to break the edges. Now because I'm going to stop my dados about 1/2 inch from the front of the cabinet, I need to cut notches on all the dividers so that they can sit flush with the front edge. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to put my dado stack in the table saw, and I'm going to put it right up against my fence just so it kisses it, and this way I can make those notches in one pass. I also applied edge banding on the front edge of all the dividers and the top and bottom. And here's one of the neat tools that I use here. I like using this little travel iron for applying the edge banding because I think it's a lot easier to balance on the edge of the plywood. I also forgot that I had this roller thingy to make sure that the edge banding was completely adhered. Now to cut all of these dados, I'm using special undersized plywood bits at the router table, which is going to make all of these joints fit nicely together. So I bought this set from Whiteside, and I like it because it comes with a bit for 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch plywood. Now you probably know this, but plywood that is called 3/4 inch isn't really 3/4 inches thick, and 1/2 inch plywood really isn't a 1/2 inch thick. So you don't want to go using regular size router bits on plywood because the fit in the joint is going to be way too loose. Now I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you'd like to check them out for yourself. And you can see here how I stopped the dado just short of the front edge for a nice clean look. Now, in case you don't have a router table, you can do this job with a plunge router, but since I have the router table, this is just much easier for me to do this job. There is a lot less chance of me wandering off my cut line and messing up the dado. Now, one tip here is to mark the start and stop points of where the cut needs to begin and end, just so I know where to lift my plywood off of the router bit and not go through the front edge. This works whether I'm starting with the plunge cut first or coming in from the side. Now to cut the long groove in the back panel, I'm going to use one of the stretchers to set the distance between the bit and the fence, since these are going to go directly behind the back panel in the final assembly. Doing relative measurements this way helps make sure that when I put this together, I get a nice tight fit. I just make the cut in one pass using the 1/4 inch undersized plywood bit. With all the dados cut, I break out the old frog tape again to cut the shelf pin holes. I went ahead and made a spacer block out of plywood so that I could start my holes in the same spot on both sides. And I used double-sided tape to hold it in place. I think this little shelf pin jig from Craig does the job nicely. It helps me keep everything evenly spaced, and it comes with an indexing pin so that I can make as many holes in a row as I need to. Now, before I assemble the cabinets, I'm going to go ahead and apply the finish to them. Now, I think this is much better to deal with now than trying to cram finish in all those corners and edges of a finished cabinet. Now, to finish these cabinets, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure 2C Hard Wax Oil. This stuff really couldn't be more simple to apply. You just mix the two parts together and then pour on a small amount and work it into the grain with a white applicator pad. Now, even though you can't smell it, trust me, it smells amazing, and watching that grain come to life, it is just the best. The Pure brings such a warmth to the walnut. Now, after the oil sits for about 5 minutes, I go ahead and I buff it all off with a cotton t-shirt. Now, you want to make sure to wipe off all that excess oil so that when you touch it, it feels dry. Now, after everything has had the oil applied to it, I need to wait 72 hours before I can flip it to the other side and finish the inside of the panels. And as you can see here, I use the frog tape to mask off the dados because you really don't want any of this oil finish getting in there. If you get that oil in those dados, you are never going to get a good glue bond. And finally, I could finish all the dividers as well as the doors and drawer fronts. And you can see here that I also masked off the edges that need to go into those dados again so I don't get any finish on them. Now for these smaller parts, I went ahead and finished both sides at once, and that's just because they're easier just to set up on edge to get both sides. And with everything covered, I just set all my parts aside to cure, which again is going to take about 72 hours. Alright, fast forward a couple of days and it's time to begin prepping for assembly. And the first thing I did was cut the pocket holes into the stretchers. These will be on the back side of the cabinets and never seen, so I went ahead with pocket holes here just to make the assembly that much easier. Once I masked off all my joints with tape, I began assembling the first cabinet. This time the masking, instead of trying to prevent oil from getting into the dados, it's preventing the glue from getting out onto the sides of the cabinet. This assembly was pretty easy, just a top and bottom and 2 dividers. Everything fit together surprisingly well, and I could go ahead and throw the other side of the cabinet on top and begin adding clamps. For the second cabinet, I went ahead and made this little sub-assembly, which is going to simplify what would have been a fairly complicated glue-up. Now, I double-checked to make sure this thing was square as a bear because this is going to be an excellent reference point to help me make the entire cabinet square. Now, after the glue up was dry, I went back and added the stretchers to the, back. And you can see here how this cabinet came together. And pardon me while I do a little maneuvery to make sure that I have enough room to slide the back panel in. And speaking of back panel, it just slides right into the grooves on the sides and fits nicely. I nailed it into place with brad nails, and that's it for now. Time to assemble the other cabinet. Alright, on the second cabinet, you can see how this little sub-assembly that I built fits really nicely into the side of the cabinet like butter. Now, once I got everything tapped into place, I added the other dividers and the other side and began clamping everything together, making sure continuously to check for square. Stretchers go in as well here, and I also added these portholes for cable management. To cut these, I just masked off the area where I was going to cut the holes and found the center of the circle right where I wanted the port to go. I then used the appropriate Forstner bit to cut the through hole nice and clean. Now these little plastic grommets fit together nicely and they cover up the edges of the hole too. And now I have 2 cabinet carcasses done. And next I'm going to move on to doors and drawers. Now I find it easier to lay the cabinet on its side and lay out the drawer fronts and doors horizontally. This way I can kind of move things around and make slight tweaks to everything's position just to make sure that I get the right layout. I can make the adjustments at the table saw until I sneak up on the right dimensions to make them all work together. For the tops of the cabinet, I'm using solid walnut that I milled up and glued together. After giving them a sanding, I went ahead and trimmed the edges with my track saw. Now I made the tops big enough to overhang the cabinet edges by about an inch or so because I was planning to do a really interesting profile on the front and sides. And it starts with cutting a curve on the front edge. I made this template out of 1/2-inch plywood and I'll tape it to the board using double-sided tape. I then used my bandsaw to cut away the waste, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of material in front of the template. Now after I cut away the bulk of the waste, I used a flush trim bit in my router table to remove the remaining waste, leaving a nice smooth curve. Cutting a perfect curve like this has to be one of the most satisfying things in woodworking. Now I wanted to complement the curve with a under bevel, and so I went ahead and exchanged out the flush trim bit for a chamfer bit, and I cut away the material on 3 sides. Now because I was doing this kind of on the fly and I really didn't know what the final piece was going to end up looking like, I didn't know really how big the under bevel needed to be, so I just kept taking the board to the cabinet, giving it a good look, taking it back to the router table, cutting off a little bit more, and just repeating that process. Now, once I finally got the look that I was going for, I went back to the Rubio Monocoat for the finish. And I just worked it in, following the grain until I got full coverage and then finished up around the edges. After 5 minutes or so, buffed off the excess oil with a cotton rag, and that is that. Now, the last thing that I really need to do here is to build the filing cabinet drawers, and I made these out of hard maple. I really like the clean, light look of the maple in contrast to the walnut of the cabinets. After milling up some maple, I went ahead and cut them to length at the table saw using my Cross Cut Sled. So I got a little paranoid and decided to do a dry fit of one of these drawers for a couple of reasons. Number one, I wanted to see exactly how long I needed to cut the little plastic rails that are going to go on top of the drawers to hold the files. And I also needed to make sure that I dialed in the exact width of these cabinets so that the files actually hung on the rails. Next up, I cut the grooves in the drawer parts to accept the drawer bottoms. The groove is 1/2 of an inch from the bottom, and that's going to leave just enough room for the drawer slide hardware. Now to cut the grooves, I just snuck up on the cut until the 1/4-inch plywood that I'm using to make the bottoms fit nicely. Now I could have also used that 1/4-inch plywood bit in the router table. I'm really not sure why I decided to do this at the table saw. I could have done it either way. And as far as construction goes, I'm going to keep it simple with pocket screws. I did this method for the first time when I made the drawers for my kitchen island, and they have worked out really great, no issues at all. Now the big advantage to pocket holes is that I don't have to spend any time making locking rabbet joints and waiting for glue to dry. But this is, however, where I made a pretty big blunder. Alright guys, so as I was going to assemble my drawer boxes, I realized I had made a pretty boneheaded mistake. So I was a little bit distracted listening to a podcast in my earphones as I was cutting these pocket holes, and I accidentally put pocket holes in the side pieces instead of just the front and back pieces where they belong. So now I've got these ugly pocket holes that I'm going to have to stop and waste time filling. Now, luckily, I just happened to have 3/8-inch maple dowel stock on hand. I got really lucky there. Otherwise, it was going to be a trip out to pick up some dowels. Or, now the other fix could have been using a dowel former. That's another option. If you have some scrap material from making your drawer boxes, you can just take some of that same material, cut it down to width and length, and drive it with a mallet through that dowel former to create your own dowels. Either way will work, and so that's what I'm going to do now. So yeah, this is not ideal, especially since I'm not painting these, But what the heck, these are just filing cabinet drawers, and rather than cut all new drawer parts, I wanted to see how well filling these pocket holes in worked. So I cut up my dowel stock and added some glue to the holes before pressing the dowels into place. Now, after letting them dry for a couple of hours, I went ahead and cut off the excess with my Japanese pull saw and sanded down the rest until they were flush. To help with some of the gaps, I went ahead and made my own wood filler out of sanding dust mixed with wood glue. Now, I use this handy little trick for collecting the sawdust. It's amazing how simple this trick is and yet so genius. I just let the filler dry for about an hour and then I went back and sanded away the excess. Now, while this worked well for some of them, I was not super happy with others, but I kept my expectations low going into this, and I just think that it was a good job given the circumstances. I definitely don't want to make this kind of mistake again. After applying the finish to the drawer boxes, I began assembly. I used my clamps to hold everything in place, and I really put a lot of pressure on them to keep the pocket holes from moving as they tend to do. After getting that set up, this is really a fast and easy process. I made sure everything stayed square and I could move on to cutting the drawer bottoms. Now I used 1/4-inch maple plywood for the bottoms, and these are just leftover scraps from my kitchen island build because I only needed 3 small pieces. I just slid them into place and tacked them along the back edge to hold them. And here's a final look at those pocket hole repairs once the finish was on the drawers. Now you can definitely see them, but the color match is pretty good, and this is just going to serve as a nice little reminder to me every time I open up this drawers to never make this mistake again. Next, I installed the catches for the drawer slides. I'm using undermount slides so I don't see any of the hardware when I open the drawers. And if you've used undermount slides before, you know you got to make this little hole on the backside to allow for this tab to engage, which just holds the drawer onto the slides. I always start by installing the top set of slides using a spacer that I cut out of MDF or plywood. Once I get those installed, I slide the drawers into place and I make sure to test them out. Now these slides are push to open. Now, I decided early on that I didn't want any hardware on the front of these cabinets because I really wanted that walnut grain to shine, and I thought this was a clever way to be able to get the drawers open. I then cut my MDF spacer down to install the second set of slides and repeat the process. To install the drawer fronts, I'm using double-sided tape. Because I'm not adding drawer pulls to this cabinet, I can't drill in from the front like I usually do to hold them in place. Once I have it in place, I use a clamp to hold it steady while I drill pilot holes and then add screws from the inside. I do the same thing for the other drawers, and I use washers as spacers between the fronts, which gives it about a 1/16 of an inch gap. You can see here how awesome this is going to look with no drawer hardware. Just all that beautiful walnut grain. Next, I went ahead and installed the tops by screwing them into place using black screws and using elongated holes on the backside to allow the top to be able to expand and contract during the seasons. And you can also see how nice that curve and bevel looks on the front. Now for the doors, I'm going to put on soft close concealed hinges. To do this, I just mark the position of the hinge and I use a center punch to mark the spot. I really dig this hinge jig for this job. It makes it dead simple to place these hinges in the right spot. You can see here how the hinge fits right into place nice and snug. Now to install these, I made a spacer and I stuck it under the shelf with 2-sided tape. This is really going to help me place the door with exactly the reveal that I want. I then mark the positions of the hinges and I go ahead and drill the pilot holes. This is just the way that I like to install door hinges because it takes the measurement and guesswork out. The hinge tells you exactly where it wants to be. I just make a few little adjustments to the hinges until the door sits perfectly in place. Now that these cabinets are basically done, I need to go ahead and make some brackets to hold the desktop in between them. And for this, I'm using some 8/4 walnut stock that I'm ripping out of an offcut from a previous project. I cut a notch out of it to make an L shape. This is going to give me a place to attach the bracket to the cabinets and also to the desk. Now, I wanted to go ahead and try to make these brackets barely noticeable as well as not pointy. I don't want to bang my knees on any sharp corners. So to accomplish this, I'm going to add some angles to the brackets in both directions. And I went ahead and used the bandsaw to freehand these cuts after I marked a reference line where I wanted the angles to go. Now back at the bench, I could go ahead and clean up those bandsaw marks with a hand plane, nice and smooth. Finally, I added some pilot holes for the screws and we're good to go. All right, to install everything, I got my cabinets into position and I added the brackets to the sides. Now, I decided to let the desktop float between the cabinets rather than building a base for it because I have been considering picking up an adjustable height standing desk in the future, and this is going to make for a nice interim solution. I set the desktop over the brackets and fastened it in the middle with screws, allowing both the front and back the ability to expand and contract with the seasons. This project turned out fantastic, and I absolutely love all the new organization space that I created for my office.